Without his vision, I promise you, there wouldn't be no Hall of Fame Allen Iverson standing at this podium if it wasn't for this guy. He gave me the vision, man. And, you want to be fast like Isaiah, and you want to shoot like Bird, rebound like Barkley, pass like Magic, be dominant like Shaq.
Philadelphia, 2001. The crowd is 20,000 people, and it sounds like twice that. A 6-foot guard with cornrows and tattoos up both arms takes the ball at half court, puts it through his legs, and a defender reaches for something that isn't there anymore. The crossover, the most dangerous 2 seconds in basketball. Allen Iverson, most valuable player, scoring champion. The answer: he earned over $154 million in NBA salary. He had a lifetime Reebok endorsement deal worth tens of millions more. He was one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet, selling out arenas, moving merchandise, and changing the look and sound of professional basketball. By 2012, he filed for bankruptcy. Court documents from his divorce revealed that he had allegedly told his wife he couldn't afford a cheeseburger. $154 million gone. This documentary isn't going to tell you Allen Iverson wasted his money and learned his lesson. That's the simplified version, the version that lets everyone off easy. The real story is more complicated, more painful, and more human than that. Because the same qualities that made Allen Iverson one of the most compelling athletes of his generation were the exact same qualities that made his life after basketball nearly impossible to survive. Hampton, Virginia sits along the Chesapeake Bay, a working city, military family, tight streets, neighborhoods where options were limited and consequences were not. Allen Iverson was born there in 1975. His mother, Ann, was 15 years old. There was no money. There was no consistency. There were stretches of his childhood without electricity, without running water, without much of anything except the knowledge that if you wanted something out of this life, no one was going to hand it to you. What Allen Iverson had, and what no degree of poverty could touch, was ability. On a football field, he was extraordinary. On a basketball court, he was a different category of thing entirely. At Bethel High School, he led the football team to a Virginia State championship. Then he turned around and did the same in basketball, in the same year. But this isn't really a story about trophies. It's about what sport meant to a kid from that background. Basketball wasn't recreation for Allen Iverson. It was his answer to everything. Every door that closed, every morning without power, every adult who looked at him like he was already decided, basketball was his rebuttal. If nobody was going to give him respect, he would take it. That mentality made him one of the greatest small players who ever lived. It also put him on a collision course with a system that had very specific ideas about who athletes were supposed to be and how they were supposed to behave. Valentine's Day, 1993. Allen Iverson is 17 years old. He is already being discussed as one of the best high school athletes in the country. His future, everyone agrees, is in professional sports. Then he walks into a bowling alley in Hampton, and everything nearly disappears. What happened at Circle Lanes that night has been contested for decades. What is documented, a verbal altercation between two groups, one black, one white, escalated into a brawl involving thrown chairs and multiple injuries. Iverson and 3 friends, later known as the Hampton Four, were arrested. The white patrons involved in the same brawl were not. The racial dimension of the case was impossible to ignore. Hampton residents divided sharply. Supporters argued that Iverson and his friends had been provoked by racial slurs and that the arrests were selective. Prosecutors argued the evidence was sufficient. The case became a community fracture, something larger than a fight in a bowling alley, even a violent one. Iverson was tried as an adult. He was convicted on 3 felony counts of maiming by mob, a Virginia statute originally written to discourage lynching mobs, now being applied to a 17-year-old black teenager. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 15 years suspended. He served 4 months in a Newport News correctional facility. 4 months during which the NBA was not a certainty. It was a fragile, uncertain thing, held together by nothing but a mother who refused to stop fighting. Ann Iverson traveled to Georgetown University and asked basketball coach John Thompson to meet her son. Thompson agreed. Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder granted Iverson clemency in December of 1993. 2 years later, the Virginia Court of Appeals overturned the convictions entirely, ruling that prosecutors had failed to prove Iverson was part of a mob as defined by law. He walked out, but before that happened, he did something inside that facility that told you everything about who he was. He refused to show weakness. He held himself together under conditions designed to break people. He decided that whatever this was, it was not going to be the end of his story. He was right, but it was close. It was very close. John Thompson was not simply a basketball coach. He was a man who understood that Allen Iverson didn't need to be softened. He needed a framework. He needed someone who recognized that the same qualities that had made this teenager difficult to manage were the same qualities that would, properly channeled, make him impossible to stop. The anger, intensity. The defiance, confidence. The refusal to be beaten by anyone ever. The most dangerous competitive fire in college basketball. But here is the question the Georgetown section of this story demands. Why was John Thompson willing to bet his entire reputation on a teenager whose future had nearly disappeared in a Hampton courtroom? Because Thompson saw something most coaches never even looked for. Not just athletic ability, that was obvious, but toughness. The specific, unmanufacturable toughness that comes from already having survived something most people never face. Iverson spent 2 seasons at Georgetown. He averaged over 23 points per game. He won the Big East Defensive Player of the Year, a remarkable distinction for a player his size. He showed the basketball world that everything they had seen in Hampton could be aimed. The NBA was watching. It had no idea what was about to arrive. June 26, 1996, the Philadelphia 76ers held the first overall pick in what many still consider the deepest draft in NBA history. Kobe Bryant was in that class. Steve Nash, Ray Allen, Peja Stojakovic. The Sixers chose Allen Iverson, a player who stood 6 feet tall and weighed somewhere around 165 pounds. Chosen first, handed the franchise, given the keys to a team that hadn't made the playoffs in 4 years and desperately needed an identity. And then the rookie took the floor. In his first season, he put the ball between his legs in front of Michael Jordan, the greatest player alive, and Jordan reached for something that wasn't there. The crossover, the moment that introduced Allen Iverson to the basketball world on his own terms. He averaged 23 points per game as a rookie and won Rookie of the Year. But almost immediately, the NBA had a problem it didn't know how to solve, because Allen Iverson was showing up to arenas looking the way he'd always looked. Cornrows, tattoos running up his arms, across his chest, down his neck, baggy jeans, chains. He dressed the way people dressed in Hampton, Virginia, not the way professional athletes were expected to dress when they represented major franchises. "I dress like guys from my neighborhood," he later said. "I wouldn't wear a suit to a basketball game. I wear sweatpants or jeans, sneakers, and let's hoop." To millions of young fans, particularly young black fans, this was not a liability. It was the whole point. Allen Iverson wasn't performing a version of himself for corporate approval. He was being exactly who he was, regardless of who was watching. The league was not ready for this. Let's be precise about what was happening, because the simplified version misses everything important. Allen Iverson wasn't simply a fashion rebel. He was the visible edge of a generational collision, a moment where hip-hop culture, black urban identity, and professional basketball were intersecting in ways that made the league's leadership deeply uncomfortable. He brought cornrows, chains, do-rags, and streetwear into spaces where players had previously been expected to perform a certain kind of respectability. He made it clear he wasn't performing anything. This was not a brand strategy. This was him. Young fans recognized it immediately. The NBA's response was slower and less gracious. In 2005, Commissioner David Stern introduced a mandatory dress code: business casual, collared shirts, dress shoes, no chains, no do-rags, no oversized clothing. The policy was framed as professional standards. Many players, and most observers outside the league's executive offices, framed it as something targeted and racially coded, a response to Iverson's influence, specifically disguised as policy. Iverson had been fined, criticized, and publicly rebuked for years by this point. He absorbed every bit of it. "I took the whipping for it," he said later. He was right, and the irony took years to fully reveal itself. because everything the league spent years trying to suppress would eventually become the most celebrated aspect of NBA culture. Tunnel walks, fashion moments, players as style icons, the entire aesthetic economy of modern professional basketball. None of it exists without Allen Iverson paying the price to drag it through the door first. May 7, 2002. The Philadelphia 76ers had just been eliminated in the first round of the playoffs by the Boston Celtics, a humiliating end to a season that had started with Iverson as the reigning MVP. Coach Larry Brown had publicly criticized Iverson's practice habits. Trade rumors were circulating. And earlier that day, Iverson had reportedly been drinking before arriving at a press conference meant to address the team's future. Earlier that same season, Iverson's best friend, Allen Iverson, had been murdered. Iverson had kept that grief close to his chest all year. He didn't share it with teammates. He carried it through every game, every practice, every media session, until it became part of the invisible weight that accompanied everything he did. In the press conference, a reporter asked about practice. What followed was 22 repetitions of one word, delivered by a man who was exhausted, grieving, possibly drunk, and on the verge of being traded from the only city that had ever felt like home. We talking about practice, not a game, not a game, not a game. We talking about practice. The clip went everywhere. It was lampooned, memed, quoted in courtrooms and sitcoms. It became shorthand for athletic selfishness, for a star too arrogant to understand the basics of professional responsibility. But here's what Iverson said about it years later. They had no idea my best friend had just got killed. The press conference wasn't about practice. It was about me being possibly traded from Philadelphia. Nobody ever talked about that. The 76ers president at the time, Billy King, later revealed that the press conference was so chaotic he made the decision to resign from his position while it was still happening. Allen Iverson, a trade rumor, a city that felt like it was slipping away. Those were the actual subjects of the press conference. The word practice was just the one that made it onto the internet. Before the fall, you have to understand the height. The 2000 to 2001 NBA season. Allen Iverson leads the league in scoring at 31.1 points per game. He wins the Most Valuable Player award. He takes a Philadelphia 76ers team with no business being there, built around one extraordinary player and a collection of role players, and drags it all the way to the NBA Finals. Against the Los Angeles Lakers, Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, Phil Jackson, the greatest team in basketball at the time, 15 wins into a playoff run and expecting to walk to another championship. Game 1, Los Angeles. Iverson scores 48 points. With under 2 minutes left, he drives into the lane, pulls up, and drops a jumper to put Philadelphia ahead by 2. A Lakers guard, Tyronn Lue, goes down in the process. Iverson, coming back up the court, steps directly over him. Not to disrespect Lue, not to perform for cameras, because that was how Allen Iverson played basketball. Without pause, without deference, without the suggestion that anything or anyone in front of him was too large to step over. Philadelphia won Game 1. The Lakers won the next 4. They took the championship. And that's the thing about Allen Iverson's peak. He climbed all the way to the summit. He showed, on the biggest stage the sport had, exactly what was possible. And then the mountain took him back. He never returned to the finals. It was the highest he would ever go, and he reached it by carrying almost everything himself. After 2001, the deterioration was gradual. And then it wasn't. The physical toll of playing the way Iverson played was cumulative and eventually catastrophic. He was 6 feet tall and he played power. He drove into 7-foot men every single night. He absorbed contact his body was never designed to absorb across 14 seasons. And by his mid-30s, the legs that had made the crossover possible were simply not the same legs. In 2006, Philadelphia made the calculation that most franchises eventually make. The era was ending. The future was elsewhere. Allen Iverson was traded to the Denver Nuggets. He played well in Denver, averaging 25 points per game alongside Carmelo Anthony. But it wasn't Philadelphia. It wasn't the place that had shaped the relationship between Allen Iverson and basketball into something that felt like belonging. Detroit followed, then Memphis, then a brief return to Philadelphia in 2009 that gave fans a chance to say goodbye, even if neither side admitted that's what it was. Then Turkey, conversations with teams that went nowhere. The persistent belief, shared by Iverson and almost nobody else, that he could still compete at the level he once defined. The game had changed while he was in it. Analytics were reshaping how franchises thought about efficiency and shot selection. The isolation-heavy, one-on-one style that Iverson had mastered was being replaced by ball movement, spacing, and three-point volume. He wasn't being left behind because he had failed. He was being left behind because the sport had evolved in a direction that moved away from him. In 2013, he officially retired. 14 seasons, an MVP, 4 scoring titles, 11 All-Star selections, over 24 points per game for his career, a number almost no player in NBA history has matched. And then, abruptly, basketball was gone. The spotlight was gone. The structure was gone. The thing that had answered every question about who Allen Iverson was and why he mattered, gone. He was 38 years old. He had no blueprint for what came next. Here is the question that brought you to this video. How does someone who earned $154 million in NBA salary plus a lifetime endorsement deal with Reebok that included $800,000 per year and a $32 million trust fund end up filing for bankruptcy before his 40th birthday? The answer has several layers, and none of them are as simple as the headline. Layer 1. The spending was extraordinary. Iverson reportedly didn't pack for road trips because he simply bought new clothes at every destination. He spent thousands at restaurants and clubs without a second thought. Jewelry, cars, mansions. The lifestyle of a player who had grown up with nothing and was now living as though money was an infinite resource. He defaulted on a debt of roughly $859,000 to a Georgia jewelry store. That triggered the bankruptcy filing in 2012. But Layer 1 is the least interesting layer. Layer 2 is the one that explains everything. From the moment Iverson signed his first NBA contract, a 3-year deal worth $8.9 million with Philadelphia, he became the financial center of a very large number of lives, old friends, childhood neighbors, people who had known him before the money, people who appeared after it, extended family, people who said they were family. At the peak of his career, by some accounts, he was supporting an entourage of around 50 people. He said it himself in an interview years later. I was reckless in the sense of, I wanted everybody to be happy. I wanted to pay everybody rent. I wanted to pay child support. I wanted to stop people from going to jail. I wanted to pay their bond, car payment. When I go to the jewelry store, y'all go to the jewelry store. When I buy a car, y'all get a car. This wasn't recklessness in the conventional sense. It was loyalty operating at a catastrophic scale. He grew up in a neighborhood where people had nothing, and when the money arrived, he shared it, because that was who he was, because those were his people, because he had never learned to separate the two. Not knowing how to handle money, he said, not having known about money your whole life, that was the tough part of it. And then Layer 3. Nobody taught him any of this. The NBA did not require financial literacy training. The people responsible for his finances had their own interests. He came from a background where financial management was not a family conversation because there had never been anything to manage. He was handed hundreds of millions of dollars with no framework for sustaining it. I never had a blueprint, he said simply. By 2012, court documents from his divorce proceedings revealed the specific phrase that became shorthand for the entire story. Allen Iverson told his wife he couldn't afford a cheeseburger. $154 million in salary, a lifetime endorsement deal. A man who couldn't afford a cheeseburger. The gap between those two facts is not a cautionary tale about greed. It's a story about what happens when an extraordinary person is handed extraordinary resources and absolutely no map for keeping them. Here is the irony that history took its time delivering. Every cultural battle Iverson fought, every fine, every dress code, every editorial about the cornrows and the chains and the baggy clothing, he lost in the moment. Then he won, completely. Walk into any NBA arena today. Watch the tunnel walks. Players arrive for games wearing custom designer outfits that are photographed, analyzed, and celebrated as fashion events. The sneaker collaboration, the streetwear, the tattoos on every roster, the hip-hop playing in every building. Player individuality, the self-expression, the willingness to arrive as a complete human being rather than a corporate product is now one of the league's most marketed features. The NBA didn't merely tolerate what Iverson carried into the league, They eventually packaged it, sold it, and built an entire cultural identity around it. The dress code that David Stern used in 2005 to suppress Iverson's influence is now a historical footnote. The tunnel walk it was supposed to prevent is now appointment content. Everything Iverson was fined and criticized for, today's players do freely, celebrated rather than sanctioned, praised rather than penalized. He was decades early, and he paid for every year of being early. The players who came after him didn't have to. What Allen Iverson actually left behind is larger than his statistics, though those statistics are extraordinary. He changed the template of what an NBA star was allowed to look like. Before him, the model was Michael Jordan, polished, carefully branded, universally palatable. After Iverson, something cracked open. Players could come from the streets and be great. They could dress like their neighborhoods. They could refuse to perform a sanitized version of themselves for the comfort of sponsors and executives. His influence on the guards who followed him is documented and direct. Dwayne Wade has cited him. Derrick Rose has cited him. A generation of smaller, faster, attack-first guards built their games, watching Iverson drive into giants without hesitation. In Philadelphia, he is not merely a retired athlete. His number 3 has been retired by the franchise. That's a permanent, non-negotiable fact about the city's relationship with its own history. His Reebok Question and Answer 5 sneakers are reissued regularly and still sell out. Vintage 76ers gear from his era is actively collected. His face on a Slam magazine cover from the late 1990s is now a cultural artifact. But none of those numbers, not the scoring titles, not the merchandise figures, not the Hall of Fame induction, capture the real thing. The real thing is this: Allen Iverson made people feel seen. Kids from neighborhoods like Hampton, players who were told they were too small, too rough, too much of something that someone else needed them to be less of. He played every single night like the living answer to everyone who had ever told him no. So what actually happened to Allen Iverson? Not the headline. The real answer: he lost the NBA spotlight. He lost the athletic prime that made him untouchable. He experienced documented, serious financial hardship. He lost control of his public image and spent years defined by press conferences and controversy, reduced in the popular memory to a clip about practice and a step over and a financial collapse. His marriage to Tawana ended, though the two would eventually reconcile. He struggled with alcohol, something he has acknowledged publicly. He made expensive decisions that no amount of talent could undo. These things are true, and they are not the complete story. His cultural influence grew after his career ended, not despite his absence, but partly because of it. The things he introduced to the league came into full flower once nobody was left to suppress them. He didn't lose his place in basketball history. He didn't lose the respect of the players who came after him. He didn't lose Philadelphia. What makes the Allen Iverson story genuinely worth telling, beyond the highlights and the scandal and the bankruptcy, is this: the qualities that built him were the qualities that complicated everything. He grew up in an environment that rewarded toughness and punished vulnerability. He learned that survival meant refusing to change for anyone, regardless of the pressure. That lesson got him out of Hampton. It got him through 4 months in a correctional facility. It carried a 6-foot guard to the MVP award and the NBA Finals. But the same lesson made him incapable of the kinds of compromises that post-career life demands. He couldn't quietly manage his wealth because he'd never learned that money required management. He couldn't shrink his circle because loyalty was the only currency he'd trusted since childhood. He couldn't accept that his career was ending because he had never accepted a limitation in his life. His greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability were the same thing. The man who refused to change, who wore what he wore, played how he played, loved who he loved, spent what he spent, was both the reason he became famous and the reason fame was so difficult to survive. There's a final image the documentary should land on. Not the step over, not the crossover, not the MVP trophy or the all-star appearances or the packed arenas in Philadelphia. Just Allen Iverson walking away from a basketball court. No crowd, no commentary, no expectations, just the man from Hampton, Virginia, exactly who he always was. He never became the player the NBA wanted him to be. He became something far more difficult to replace: himself.